There are 7 main impacts of the transatlantic slave trade. The first was the depopulation of the continent, right? So let's take a look at this closely. The depopulation of the continent, especially the western coast of the continent. Now, the western coast, let's come to the map here. Now, the western coast was where most of the slaves were taken, and that's because it was most convenient for the Europeans to come from Europe, especially from England, down the Atlantic Ocean to the western coast. So it was most convenient for them to just come down the Atlantic Ocean to the western coast and take slaves. So the depopulation of the continent was one of the main impacts of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, let's put in mind that this slave trade occurred over a 341-year period, right? So this is a very long time to be taking slaves. And you could imagine that during this time of taking slaves and not allowing the Africans to reproduce and so forth as much as possible, it will really have an impact on the population of the continent, right? So 341 years specifically started in 1526 to 1867, right? So 1526 to 1857. And during this time, they were taking slaves, right? Between 12 to 15 million Africans were taken during this time. This is substantial. This is a lot of population. Back then, there were not a lot of Africans, obviously. Even today, we have just 1.2 billion Africans. So 12 to 15 million Africans was a substantial chunk of the population. So let's understand this point because it's a very important point to put it in context in terms of the depopulation of the continent. That meant they've taken, men that could, work on the land and the farm and so forth. They've taken women that could reproduce, etc. That means they've taken, labor from the continent away, and that will impact the continent in many ways, in agriculture, in ability to reproduce, in working, the workforce, just things that people do in society. All of those things impacted. Very important for us to take note of this point. Now, the second impact is the development of foreign, mostly European colonies. Right now, what does that mean? That means that they were able to establish their colonies in different parts of the continent, right? Beginning from the western coast of the continent, most of the countries in the western coast were colonized by France and Britain and Portugal, right? You can start from the Gambia, Senegal, Sierra Leone, Liberia wasn't colonized, Guinea, Ivory Coast, Ghana, Togo, Benin Republic, Nigeria, going down to the southern coast of the continent. Most of the countries were colonized. So they were able to establish colonies all over the continent. They were able to extract resources from those colonies. And this is also a very important point to note, because they were taking those resources out of the continent back to their countries and profiting from those resources. And Africans were not getting the benefit of their own resources. So the development of foreign, mostly European colonies on the continent, and of course we have the different countries with the languages, speaking the languages of the colonizers, French, English, in some parts of the continent, Portuguese, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, for example, speaking Portuguese and so forth. So the impact was very, very significant in this context. Now, the third one is made it easier for European countries to colonize the continent, right? So now we're talking about slavery, but then after slavery came colonization. When the Europeans had their conference, the Berlin Conference in 1884 to 1885, they decided how to split the continent amongst the colonizing European countries. And because slave trade had already established the routes, it was very easy for them to come from Europe to colonize the continent, because the routes have already been established. There's a blueprint out there, and they were able to use the blueprint to colonize the continent, right? So made it easier for European countries to colonize the continent, because again, the blueprint is already out there, and all they had to do is to follow the blueprint, come to the continent and colonize the continent. Number 4 is open trade routes between the continent and the rest of the world. Right? So now most people say, oh, well, this is a positive point. What's wrong with this? Well, then you have to understand that the trade was a one-way trade. And the Europeans benefited from this trade. Africans did not benefit from this trade. The trade was occurring, the materials were coming from the continent, but they were not benefiting from this trade. And that's an important point to note as well. Right? So open trade routes between the continent and the rest of the world, where European powers were taking precious materials from the continent and trading those materials all over the world, taking it to their own countries, benefiting from it. And again, this is also a very important point to note. Right? So while it opened the trade routes, it was a one-way trade in terms of those who were benefiting from it, and Africans were at the short end of the deal. Now, number 5, the destruction of the core fabric of African societies. This is perhaps the most important impact of the slave trade. Why is that? Because it destroyed African culture, destroyed African tradition, destroyed their customs, right? And imposed foreign languages on the continent. Right, so the slave trade really impacted the African society in terms of tearing communities apart, tearing families apart. Traditional chiefs were selling their subjects, and that really brought about distrust amongst Africans and communities that once upon a time before the slave trade were getting along very well. We were getting along very well. Right, so the destruction of the core fabric of the African continent, laying the seed of distrust amongst Africans, suspicions, and strife, and all whatnot amongst the Africans, because some of them were selfish and were selling their brothers, selling their community members, and that led distrust in the continent. Right, number 6 is the long-term impoverishment of the continent. Why is that? Because, as I already mentioned, they were taking resources from the continent, precious materials from the continent. Now, the continent has so many resources, as you can see, gold, diamond, crude oil, uranium, the list is long. All of those were extracted, were taken from the continent and taken to the European countries, for the benefit of the Europeans and not for the benefit of Africans. So long-term impoverishment of the continent is a very key impact as well that is even felt today, long after slave trade has ended. It's still being felt. And finally, the mental and physical impact on Africans. Imagine, families being torn apart. Imagine, women taken away from their families, some of them pregnant women taken away from their families and thrown onto the ship. The cruelty and the psychological impact of seeing all of these things happening, taking, men that could till the land, that could walk the agricultural fields and so forth, taking them, bundling them onto the ship. And all of this had tremendous impact on the psyche of Africans. The trauma was evident, and the impact was long lasting, and this is a very important point to note as well, because the transatlantic slave trade really impacted Africans on many fronts, as you can see, and the impact today is still very evident. Now, after the transatlantic slave trade came colonization. So there was no rest for the continent. And the slave trade decimated the continent in terms of population, as we have established. And then colonization came and did further harm to the continent, imposing languages, foreign languages, again, stealing materials and minerals and so forth, enslaving Africans, etc. These are tremendous impact that are long-lasting, long after slavery has ended. The effects are still being felt.